Good evening. I want to welcome you all to our Christian Education Ministries online training. We're going to begin our presentation tonight. Elisa Prince, our accounting associate with the Office of Central Services, will be our presenter tonight. She is going to be going over payroll and taxes, and I know this is exciting information, so we're excited to hear what you have to say tonight. We hope that your questions can be answered. Please feel free to chat, ask your questions as they come up, and at this point, I will be turning it over to Elisa. So Elisa, if you'll just join us now. Thank you.
Hi, glad you all could join us tonight. I hope I can keep you awake at the late hour talking about payrolls and taxes, because this is not something that's all exciting. It's usually very detailed, very cumbersome, but very important for your organization. So the first thing we want to talk about tonight is a little piece of information. Whether you have an employee or do you have an independent contractor? This question comes up a lot with congregations. Do I treat someone as an employee, or can I treat them as a 1099 contractor? So here are some guidelines to help you decide when you have someone that is doing work for you, whether you're supposed to classify them as an employee or a contractor. An employee is directed and supervised. Their work is overseen by someone in the church in some manner or capacity. A contractor can set their own work and their own schedule. They have a job to do. They can get it done whenever they want to get it done, pretty much, and don't have to be in an office from 8 to 5 sitting at a desk doing a job. Employees have an ongoing employment relationship. It is a continuous relationship. But a contractor will be able to set their own hours for work. An employee normally works for one employer, but a contractor will work for other clients doing the same type of work for multiple clients. So you have someone in your church who is a professional pianist. They play for your church, and they play for someone else, and they play for the symphony, and they play for others. That would be considered, in my opinion, a contractor, because you've got someone who has a professional skill that is used for others, to fulfill other clients' wishes as well. An employee normally works set hours. They usually have a time in which they're supposed to be available in the office or by phone if they're at home. However, they're supposed to have a set hours. Contractors normally work by the job. You tell them what you need done, and they say, I'll handle it by that date. And they get it finished and completed by that date. A few more things. An employee can be dismissed. You have the right to fire that individual. A contractor is paid by contract, and it's a little different situation. You may have a contract with them. It's a binding contract, and as long as they're living up to the part of the contract, that they're supposed to be doing, then you don't necessarily have a right to dismiss them. You can, you'd have to take them to court. It would be a big situation to get out of a contract if there was a legal contract signed between you and another entity. But they're normally just paid by contract. So once the job is over, there is no relationship anymore. The relationship is severed. Employees are reimbursed for expenses, whereas a contractor normally pays their own expenses, has their own equipment. If you have someone who does videography for you, someone that comes in and videos things outside of the normal things, they may have their own equipment. They bring their own equipment. They use their own editing software. They do their own stuff. But you get the finished product. They don't. So that's the difference between that. One thing that makes an employee This is one thing that helps me solidify in my mind that a minister under a call is an employee, because the employee gets benefits, company benefits, insurance, retirement. Those types of benefits are for employees only. Contractors don't get vacation days. They don't get employee benefits like insurance and retirement. A contractor has to obtain their benefits privately. So these are some good things that you can use to think. An employee, you use a W-2 for them at the end of the year. Independent contractors receive a 1099 miscellaneous form for work over $600 or more. These are to be given to the employee by January 31st and filed with the IRS or Social Security Administration, state, whoever it is, by February 28th. So the difference between these two is that one is considered employee, one is a contractor. One is a W-2 employee, one is a 1099 contractor. So there's some different forms you have to have when you hire these people or make a contract with this person as well. We're going to talk about that next. If you hire an employee, you should be giving them a W-4 form for them to complete, and I'm sure you all are very familiar with those. They should be able to tell you how many exemptions, whether they're single, married, and all that, and therefore you'll use those tables as your withholding tables for them. There's also an I-9 form. It is from immigration, and it is to prove that this is a person that is eligible to work within the United States of America. So there are many classifications there. Normally, if the person can provide you with a passport, it's easy peasy. If they can provide you with a Social Security card and a driver's license, it makes it very easy as well. There are some other combinations. There's a clear layout on the instructions of this form as to what will satisfy this. But this has got to be done, and you need to be keeping this on file. The E-Verify website is very important right now. E-Verify is used for new employees. It is a federal website, and you use the information that you have received on the I-9 form to be able to put information into the system. It will, if you have the person's giving you a driver's license or a passport, you will actually see the photo pop up on the screen, and you will have to identify that individual. E-Verify is mandatory in the state of South Carolina for new employees. It is supposed to be done within 3 days of hire. It's very simple to do and very simple to set up, so I suggest you go to that website and get things set up. Each state is a little different in their requirements, but I do know the state of South Carolina is mandatory. So you probably need to go onto that website itself and see if your state has a mandatory reporting. It's very simple to do, and then you just print out a case that has been closed. You print the information after they have verified the person's eligible, and you file it in their personnel file. Keep all that together, and you're covered. There's also usually a state requirement within your states. A lot of times this is for garnishment of wages. The reason that this is required, not necessarily to prove that the person is eligible to work for you, but to prove that the person may have some kind of a garnishment on their wages due to child support, taxes unpaid, different things. So this, South Carolina has a website. I know North Carolina has one. I've used it for, I think, Virginia as well. So you need to go into your state, just Google and try to see if your state has a requirement. And I think we do have a question over here in the chat right now. It says, if an employee has been working for many years, is it necessary to have an I-9? At this point, it wouldn't hurt to go ahead and get one completed and just put it in your file. You would not have to go to E-Verify because they're a new person, but it would show that you've made the effort to verify that they are legitimate and you've got something in their file. It's just I don't know that it's mandatory to go back and do it. But E-Verify is, I would not think would be something you'd want to do. Just do the I-9 and put it in your file. But for all new employees, I would be going to E-Verify at this point, or checking to see if my state is required to do that. I hope that answers your question. All right, we all know that pastors are treated differently than a normal employee. So let's look at some things about a clergy tax issue. There was a landmark case, Weber versus Commissioner, and this was a Methodist minister, and it determined that he was a W-2 employee rather than an independent contractor. This is what I said earlier about I feel that ministers are supposed to be a W-2 employee. The court stated the following as criteria in determining the status. The minister was subject to significant control. He was required to work at the church to which he was assigned or called, if we want to use the Presbyterian term. The minister didn't have the right to unilaterally discontinue regular services of the local church. The minister can't just close the church. Presbyterian, our denomination, has that right, but the minister does not. The position was intended to be permanent as opposed to transitory. This means that the minister was, an employee until he decides to leave the church. Things change, not just because a job was finished. The job is a continuous job. The benefits such as health insurance and pension indicated an employment relationship. So try to remember this situation as far as a minister goes. A minister has what we call dual tax status. This gets a little confusing. Housing allowance is something that a minister is allowed to have that most others do not. It puts them in some weird situations as far as self-employed for Social Security purposes, and they are regularly an employee for federal and state taxes. But Social Security, they're considered self-employed. This is what we mean by dual tax status. Social Security, self-employed, federal, state, employee of the church. We'll go into that a little bit more in a minute. I just kind of want to get that idea in your head. Income tax withholding. Clergy does not have to have tax withholding. They can decide they do not want to have federal and state taxes withheld. Do not have to. Other employees, it's mandatory that they have federal and state withholding. And if they don't have enough of it, they can get penalized in the long run, if they don't get close enough to what they really would owe on the tax thing. But a minister is not required to withhold. Okay? He can, however, choose to voluntarily have federal and state taxes withheld. That is fine. Another thing that clergy has is a potential double deduction. Because housing allowance is not taxed at the federal or state level, and a minister may use that housing allowance to pay a mortgage on a home and then deduct the mortgage interest as well on his taxes, it kind of gives him a little bit of a double deduction, because you're getting a deduction for the full housing allowance and then also getting another deduction for the part of the housing allowance that's used to pay interest on a mortgage. That's why housing allowance is so helpful for a minister. FICA taxes. This is an issue that you need to be aware of as well. FICA type Social Security taxes should never be withheld from the compensation of a clergy because they are self-employed for Social Security purposes. They have to file a Schedule SE with their own personal tax return to compute their self-employment Social Security tax unless they have opted out of Social Security. They cannot just say they don't want to be part of Social Security. There is a formal process with the IRS to opt out of Social Security. There's a form that has to be filed because of religious objection to Social Security. in order to say you don't want to participate. So Social Security cannot be withheld on a minister. Medicare, FICA, Social Security, whatever you want to call them, cannot be withheld on a minister. Now, one thing you can do, because remember I just said they can, if they want to, withhold federal, and they can withhold state. Because the federal money that's withheld goes to the same place and the same account and same pot at the IRS that Social Security withholding goes to. A minister can say to you, I want to withhold federal, and I want to withhold extra federal of $200 a month, turn that in with my stuff. And you do withhold extra $200 federal. You turn in to the IRS with your payments, your withholding payments, the $200 as federal. Well, when he gets ready to do his personal taxes and his Schedule SE and all of that, the money that is brought in through the IRS, through the federal withholding area, it's all lumped into one thing on his taxes, his tax return. He can use the money that he has had withheld under federal to help pay the portion of Social Security that he's going to be required to pay by that Schedule SE. I have a feeling that was real confusing, what I just said, and I hope not. But it's very complicated thought process to think of. Do not withhold Social Security. He can withhold extra federal if he wants to, and that will help him when he goes to do his taxes not have to fork out a whole lot of money, because he is going to be paying the Social Security portion that the employer would pay and the Social Security portion that employee would pay. So he pays both sides of it. So that's why a lot of churches have a Social Security allowance for the pastor. And a Social Security allowance is basically additional salary. That's what it really is, boils down to. Okay, any questions at this point? I know I just opened up a can of worms. Okay, moving forward. Accountable and non-accountable expenses. These are some things that are critical in knowing what is taxable income to the minister and employees and what is not. Okay? Under an accountable plan, you have proof of an expense. You are accountable for the expense. You turn in a receipt. You turn in a mileage report. Something. There is proof of the expense. With a non-accountable expenses, there is no proof of an expense. Okay? Which means money has just been given to someone without that. Okay, I have a question from Lauren E. right quick. I'm going to go back and answer that. It says, is the Social Security allowance taxable? Yes, it is. It is federal and state taxable, and he will be reporting it on his SE as self-employment income. So, yes, Social Security allowance is taxable. It is basically additional salary. It is not free money. There is no receipt that has been turned in for that. You're not reimbursing someone. You're just giving them money. So, yes, it's taxable. Okay, so here we go. There's no proof of an expense there. An accountable plan, under an accountable plan, it is not taxable, but under non-accountable, it is. So let's say you have an allowance for your minister for books, and he gets $200 a year for books. If you just give that to him in a paycheck, and he has not turned in, or a check, any check, and he has not turned in a receipt equal to $200 at a minimum, then that $200 is taxable to him, because it is not a reimbursement of a business expense that has been proven to have been spent, and now you're reimbursing it. If you give them allowances and they don't prove to you what they've used it for, it is taxable. So I think I just dropped a big bomb on that one. And remember, we're talking business expenses. If there is ever a personal expense paid for by the church, that's definitely taxable to them, because personal doesn't even come into the picture. It has to be a business expense to be reimbursed. A personal expense is not supposed to be reimbursed. It's not supposed to be part of the church situation. So if you ever give someone money for a personal expense, that immediately is a taxable situation. All right, allowances that are non-accountable, no proof of expense, must be included in box 1 of a W-2, which is what I'm talking about with the Social Security allowance. Except for the designated housing allowance, it is the only exception. It should be included in box 14 of a W-2, and you can also write a description beside it, and you can write the word housing. This box is informational only for the IRS. They know not to levy federal taxes on that, but that is a box that is important for the minister, because he will take that housing allowance and add it to his box 1 total to know what to report as full wages. But the Social Security wages, self-employment wages, is going to be calculated on his personal tax return. But box 14 for the IRS is informational only. They are not looking for a tax on that. They just want to know what it was. Housing allowance. Okay, that's what I just said. Sorry, I just now popped that up there. We will be giving you a copy of PowerPoint, so you'll have this stuff to go by. Okay, remember I'm going to say this first before we go into the common church errors. Remember to do your quarterly 941 forms. Make sure that you balance those forms to your payroll and the amounts that you've already, if you've have already remitted any withholdings, that you make sure that they agree with your report. At the end of the year, you need to balance your W-2s to the 941s to make sure that everybody agrees. Because if they don't, you'll get an ugly little letter from the IRS, and it opens up a 2-year can of worms, usually, when they start asking these questions. So I don't think you want to be dealing with that. On your 941, because the minister does not participate in Social Security withholding, you will not be having any wages or Medicare withholding, which is lines 5A through 5D of the 941. You will not include any wages or withholding for the minister in boxes 5A through 5D of the 941. Now, if you have a church secretary, her information would go there, his information would go there. Any other employees, but an ordained minister, no. Okay, ordained minister, no. Boxes 3 through 6 of a minister's W-2 will also be blank, because boxes 3 through 6 of a W-2 refer to Social Security withholding, Medicare withholding, Medicare wages, Social Security wages. Those 4 boxes are blank for an ordained minister. Okay, I'm going to say one more thing about a 1099 miscellaneous form too. Remember to accumulate throughout the entire calendar year anything that you're paying to someone that is a contractor. We have here several agencies in our office, and they all have conferences throughout the year. So one of the things I have to be careful about here is that if I pay someone a fee to speak at this event, and then I pay them another fee later in the year to speak at that event, I have to mark both of those, add them up together, and if they are 600 or more, then they get a 1099 from our organization, even though they were only paid 200 there, 400 here. They hit the $600 mark, the magic number, and I have to give them a 1099 miscellaneous form. It is required. So it's not a one-time shot, it's a year thing, just like the W-2 is. It's the entire year. And you do not have to do that for corporations. So if you're paying any corporation, you don't have to do it. But an individual, yes. It also has to be filed by February 28th with the IRS and given to the person by January 31st so they can use it on their taxes. One thing I suggest is that if you have people that are going to be receiving a 1099 miscellaneous form from you, or possibly could, I suggest that you go to the IRS website and get a form called a W-9, and you give it to them, ask them to fill it out and send it back, give it back to you. All it is asking them for is their name, their address, their social security number, their signature, and to date it. That's what they're going to fill out and give it to you. It's proving to them who you are. Proving to you who they are, so that when you get ready to do your 1099 form at the end of the year for that individual, you've got all their information. Otherwise, you won't have their social security number, and you're going to need it. You won't have maybe their mailing address because you just wrote them a check, they picked it up. You're going to need it. So that form, if possible, get it completed before you hand them the first check, and keep it on file in your office. It will save you a lot of trouble in December, January, when you're scrounging trying to find it. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about are some common church errors. They're kind of recapping some things that we've talked about tonight. Withholding FICA and Medicare taxes on ministers is one of the most common things that happens. I have seen that happen. I have talked to churches that have been doing that, and now they know that's not something they should be doing. I've had churches that didn't give their pastor a 1099 or a W-2. They didn't give him anything, and he just kind of figured out what he earned and turned it all in on his own taxes. We need to be good stewards and be responsible, and provide the reports that we need to provide to the different people and agencies that need it. If you have someone who is not a minister, not an ordained minister, and you're trying to give them a housing allowance, that won't work either. Housing allowance can only be given to an ordained minister working in the ministry situation. If you have someone who is living in the parsonage, it can be the ordained minister. There is a way to calculate what that housing is worth and may be necessary for their Schedule SE if the home is owned by the church. If it's a non-minister that's living in the church's property, then we have another situation, because that is wages to that individual, because they're living free, so it's a benefit to them, and it is not something, because they're not a minister, that's allowed to be free. Sometimes people tend to forget to record 403B contributions and put them in box 12 of the W-2 with a code E. If you have a 403B plan that your church allows your people to participate in, you do need to reflect that in on their W-2 in box 12 with a code of E and the amount of contributions that they gave to the 403B out of their pay. Our organization here, our denomination, the retirement plan for our ministers, does not fall under a 403B. But you would want to mark that they are in a retirement plan. There's a little checkbox on the W-2 that says, are they in a retirement plan? And yes, they are. If they're involved in ours. And you probably know that because you pay us a contribution if so. But we have a defined benefit pension plan, which is different. It is not something that comes out of the employee's salary or that they elect to give like a 403B is. The defined benefit plan is paid solely by the church on behalf of that employee. It is not taken out of the employee's pay like a 403B is. Make sure that you have to include the bonuses, the taxable gifts, ministerial fees, all of those things in a W-2. Okay? Don't forget all the little pieces that hang around. Sometimes we forget that if you have a paid personal expense, like I said earlier, you've got to include that as income. Even little Christmas gifts, like here at the office, if for any reason we get a $50 Christmas bonus or something like that, that has to be included as income to us. Can't just be given, even in a gift card situation. You can't do it that way. You can give us a ham or a turkey, but the government will not allow you to even give a gift card to someone without counting it on their W-2 because it's considered money. Sometimes we have situations where you have a situation where people are paying for utilities, lawn care, repairs for the minister's house, in addition to his housing allowance. If these things are not already included in the housing allowance, then they become taxable income that should be reported on the W-2. Because these things, if you're getting a housing allowance, you can't pay for those things and a housing allowance. They all got to fit. So if you're going to give someone a housing allowance, don't go and pay for their lawn care, because then that is not a good situation. We can't designate a minister as self-employed for all tax purposes. We cannot do 1099s for ministers. We should be doing W-2s. That is one of the biggest issues that we see. And if you think about that now, with the benefits situation and with the Affordable Care Act that we have been having to fall under, last year we had to fill out those forms, the 1095Cs, for every person who worked 30 hours or more per week with your organization, because they were eligible for insurance from your organization. And you had to fill out a form and give it to them saying whether or not you had offered them coverage, was it affordable, how much of it did you pay, all that thing. That right there complicates the idea of trying to send someone a 1099 when you're filling out an employee form of a W-2 and a benefits form. And the government seems to be wanting to kind of match the employer information with the W-2 information on those two forms. So if you give someone a 1099 and not a W-2, but then you give them a form saying I've given them employee benefits, it's going to throw a lot of red flags up. So just be aware of that situation. Some people forget to file their 941s in a timely manner. That can cause penalties. Do you give a 1099, Helen asked, do you give a 1099 to a limited liability corporation company? No, because it's a limited liability corporation. LLC means corporation, so you will not have to do that. You do not have to give a 1099 to LLC. Like I told you before, I have run into churches that did not issue W-2s or 1099 forms at all. Neither one, nothing. Please do that. That is just needs to be required of the church to do that. I appreciate it if you would. Sometimes payroll tax deposits aren't made on time either. You can get some penalties with that as well. So be careful to watch that. Make sure you get your timing right for your deposits. Trying to think if there's anything else I want to say. I will say this about the housing allowance for ministers. This is one way that you can really help your minister. Each church should have in writing what the minister's housing allowance is going to be. It would be a good idea. It's just a good idea to have it in writing, have the minister sign it, the clerk of session sign it, the church keep a copy, the individual pastor keep a copy. The housing allowance can be changed on an annual basis. It does not go retroactive, so you can't back up, but from the point forward of the signature of the form or the agreement, you can go forward with a new housing allowance. Housing allowance does save the minister federal and state taxes on that money. So, ministers should try to maximize the usage of that housing allowance thing to help them out financially. We're not suggesting you do anything that you shouldn't do, but a minister should really know the actual expenses of their home. They should include in it like utilities, lawn care, renovation. There's a long list of things that can be included. It's even furnishings. So utilities, property taxes, insurance on the home, all these different things can be added up to determine the actual expense that it costs to live in that home. That amount, if that they can substantiate, is where their housing allowance number should be. If they know they're getting ready to do a big remodel of the house in the next calendar year, then they should pick a number, a conservative number, one that they know they're going to hit, and up their housing allowance that year and reduce the salary. So it can be changed on an annual basis, and it will help the minister greatly. Are there any other questions about anything that I have said tonight? Okay, I have another chat question. Let's see. For business expenses, our pastor has a debit card, and his expenses come directly from the church account, eliminating the need for reimbursing him for expenses. Do we need to keep proof of the expenses in this case? I would ask him to keep his receipts and be turning them into you so that you can keep them. Yes, there needs to be something to substantiate it. Even on the back of the debit card, if he eats lunch with somebody or has a meeting with someone, on the back of the receipt, he should write the purpose of that meeting and who he was with and turn those in. And yeah, that's the same as just circumventing writing him a check. So you do need some kind of backup for that. For your sake, I would, yes.
Yeah, this is Derek Anderson. I was going to ask a question because I've got a couple of them that might take a little bit of time.
Okay.
You said earlier that the pastor, the minister, can decide to withhold additional amounts, and I'm assuming if he does that and then applies that to any debts, that there's no taxes on that. Now, you talked earlier about additional taxes.
Well, I'm saying if he's withholding money, you're not giving him more. He's taking money you're already giving him, and he's going to withhold additional federal.
Right.
So that will not change his tax situation. It doesn't change his earnings. It just changes how much of it he's putting aside to give to the IRS for later. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but you gave an example that well, maybe I misheard it. But that's okay. The second question.
Okay.
Yeah. Second question I have is, if you have a person who comes and is regularly a guest pastor when your pastor goes on vacation, and you pay him a certain amount, are we supposed to use a 1099 on that, or does that make him an employee, or what?
I would say that a supply like that, I call that a supply minister.
Yeah.
I would give them a 1099. They are not there for the long haul. They're in and out, and they may do that for other churches. They may not. You know what I'm saying? That is something they could do for other churches. So someone that's filling in the pulpit a Sunday here, a Sunday there, yes, that's fine, 1099. Now, if you have an interim pastor that is going to be there for a 6-month period or more, or something like that, I would reconsider and put that as a W-2, because they're going to be doing ongoing visitation, lots of services, filling the role of the minister in all capacities, not just preaching a sermon.
Okay, so if you don't exceed the 600, you don't have to worry about it.
Correct.
All right.
I will say that earlier, I think maybe what I confused you on, I was trying to figure out what I said that may have been confusing. A lot of churches give a Social Security allowance. A Social Security allowance is because the church feels bad because the minister is going to have to pay the employer portion of the Social Security that they would normally have paid for, like their church secretary or somebody. The minister will be responsible for paying that himself when he files that SE form, that self-employment form for his taxes. So what they decide to do is figure out from his salary and his allowances and all that stuff that's going to be on his W-2, they usually take that and say, okay, about 7.5% or so roughly is the amount of this that he's going to wind up having to pay over here. So we're just going to bump his salary up 7.5% and give him a larger salary. And that does include, that Social Security allowance would then be added to his salary figure that he already had and entered in box 1 as his total taxable federal wages. So it's kind of like just giving him a little raise because they know he's got something to pay over here. Some churches call it a Social Security allowance because they want the church to know why they're giving the man the money. Some churches just decide to give him a larger salary, and on their budget they just call it salary. When it comes down to it, on the W-2, any allowance that does not have a receipt is box 1 income on a W-2. Now let's say you have someone that has an auto allowance. If they're not keeping mileage reports or something like that to give you something to offset the auto allowance or travel allowance, you've got a situation there too where that is taxable to them because there's no proof of a reimbursement situation. So they can either keep a mileage record, and at the end of the year you can kind of add all that up and see if they at least came up to the amount of money that you would have. You can take the IRS rate times the number of miles that they drove and say, they would, if I had reimbursed them, I would have given them, $3,000, but their allowance was only $2,000, so therefore nothing was taxable to them because really they were $1,000 in the hole. But if they turn in their mileage and you've given them $2,000 throughout the year in their payroll check, and they only, when you multiply their miles times the IRS rate, you only come up to about $1,200, then $800, the difference between the $2,000 and the $1,200 that they substantiated, is now taxable to them and needs to be on their W-2. as taxable income in box 1. Federal wages and state wages. I don't know what the number for the state is, but box 1 is federal. So basically it comes down to, can they prove what they did with the money? Because you can give somebody a travel allowance, and if they don't prove what they did with the money, they could have went out and bought a big screen TV, personal, and you won't know it. So the proof is on the church to be able to prove that when they reimburse something, this is why we reimbursed it. Or if they gave somebody allowance for something and didn't get reimbursement, we counted that as income and we put it on their W-2. That's the proof on the church. It's on them. Any other questions? Okay, I thank you for your time. Remember that you have our email addresses, our phone numbers. Feel free to contact us with questions, and we'll try to guide you and help you as much as possible. But thank you so much for your time. I'm going to turn it back over to Judy.
Thank you very much for your participation tonight, and you'll be receiving some information for me as well as the next link. I understand a couple of people had some trouble getting onto the recording sites. I'll be checking those URLs again for you to be sure that you can get on. If anybody else has had any problems, or if you have any problems accessing it, please send me an email to jhodges, HODGES, at arpsynod.org, and I will speak with you personally. Thank you very much for joining us again tonight, and we look forward to being with you again. Have a good evening.